It's hard to believe that smartphones haven't always been a thing, but it's true. Last decade, when they took the world by storm, the market was a real mess, with an entire slew of operating systems battling it out in what can only be described as a grand battle royale. In the end, however, after the rise and fall of Symbian, BlackBerry OS, Bada, and even Windows Phone, two dominant operating systems remained at fairly even odds. These are, of course, Apple's iOS and Google's Android. In this video, we'll be comparing the two operating systems, covering both software and hardware. We hope that by the end of this video, you'll know exactly which operating system is better suited for you. So without any further ado, let's begin. Before we start comparing them, however, we need to just do a brief segment on how they operate. At first glance, Android and iOS may seem quite similar, at least as far as interface is concerned. But there are some fundamental underlying differences in how they function. iOS is Apple's proprietary mobile operating system, and as such, it's fine-tuned to make the most out of a device's hardware. What's more, Apple keeps a very close eye on all third-party software that's being developed for their mobile operating system. Android OS, on the other hand, may be owned by Google, but it's an open-source OS based on a Linux kernel. This basically means that anyone is free to improve and change it as they see fit. Android is much more widespread because of this, but it also means that it's more open to security threats and some logistical hiccups, but more on that later. Now, with that out of the way, let's start comparing the two. The first category that we'll have these operating systems duke it out in is performance. Stop us if this sounds familiar. iPhones are overpriced because their hardware is bad. This has got to be the argument that's thrown around the most against iPhones. And there is some truth to it. Just look at the latest Android flagships shipping with 4, 6, or even 8 GB of RAM, while the latest flagship iPhones are still stuck at 4. The older models usually boasting just 2 or 3 GB of RAM. But here's the thing. iPhones simply don't need more RAM because their operating system is so well optimized that it can juggle over a dozen apps effortlessly with just as little as 2 GB of RAM. Meanwhile, Android phones with just as much or even more RAM often fall behind in terms of memory management and multitasking. So while iPhones do indeed have worse hardware specs, they've also proven that on-paper specifications aren't everything. And the same goes for their CPUs. It was only recently that iPhones upgraded to hexa-core processors with the iPhone 8. While the older models use either quad-core or dual-core CPUs. Meanwhile, it's pretty commonplace to see an octa-core processor even in mid-range Androids. It has been for years now. But once again, due to better optimization, it's not unusual to see that last year's iPhone beat the latest Android flagship in benchmarks, let alone the weaker mid-range phones. If we were judging the hardware on its own, then Android would have won this round. But given that we're taking performance here, the victory goes to the iOS. Moving on, let's take a look at the ways that these two handle displays. The two most dominant technologies used for mobile displays at the moment are IPS LCD and OLED. Cheaper Android phones and older iPhone models predominantly use IPS LCD displays, though most flagships have recently made the jump to OLED. Both of these technologies come with their own pros and cons, although OLED is superior from a technical standpoint for 3 reasons. A, it's more power efficient because every pixel is lit individually, so the display doesn't need a backlight to illuminate the entire screen when it's turned on. B, it has great color accuracy, viewing angles, and unprecedented contrast ratios, though high-quality IPS displays can pretty much rival it in everything but contrast. And C, OLED displays reflect less light, which can be invaluable for people who spend a lot of time outside and don't want to deal with the glare. Ultimately though, IPS displays have the benefit of being much cheaper to manufacture, which is why so many OEMs use them for the more affordable phones. Just remember that there's a big difference in quality between the display used in a $200 phone and that found in a $1,000 flagship. In any case, since the two technologies belong to different price brackets and since they're both widely used, we'll call this round a tie. As far as cameras are concerned, their quality will depend solely on the original equipment manufacturer. With iPhones, the OEM is always Apple, and the cameras have consistently been very good. Android, on the other hand, covers the entire spectrum of possibilities. The lower-priced phones could have downright horrible cameras, but then some high-end Androids have cameras slightly better than the ones in iPhones. Still, the differences are fairly minor. The only way that you can spot a difference between the cameras on the latest iPhone and the latest flagship from a big Android OEM is side-by-side comparison. And even then, the differences in quality would be fairly minor. Seeing how greatly camera quality can vary and how the high-end ones are usually on fairly even terms, we'll call this round a tie as well. The app stores are a bit tricky to compare the two by. iOS definitely had the upper hand at first when it came to the number of apps in the App Store, but Google's Play Store has since overtaken Apple in regards to the sheer number of apps available. This gap can be attributed to Android's open source nature. What's more, Android phones allow user access to third-party stores as well as manual sideloading of APK files, which means that the difference in app count is effectively even larger. But we all know that quantity and quality are two very different things. Android phones may have access to more apps, but Apple's strict control of which apps make it to the App Store ensures that the apps available there are entirely safe and free of any malicious code. However, another thing worth noting is that the Play Store has many more free apps than the App Store does. Of course, this does come with some strings attached, the strings in question being ads. And if you want to get rid of these pesky pop-ups, you'd have to pay for the app, just as you would on an App Store. Still, being able to download and test an app for free before buying it is definitely a good option to have. On a final note, not only do Android phones have access to a greater variety of more diverse apps, but they also have access to some types of apps which aren't available on iOS. Most notably, if you're a gamer, you might appreciate being able to download console emulators on your phone and play some classic games that you wouldn't be able to play on an iPhone. Ultimately, we'll have to give the win here to Android, especially since Google has steadily been making the Play Store more secure as the years went by. The next category we'll be taking a look at is variety, device variety to be precise. Since all iPhones are manufactured exclusively by Apple, there isn't much variety to be found. There would be a big jump in design every few years, such as with the latest leap from the iPhone 8 to the iPhone 10, but otherwise you pretty much know what to expect from iPhones year after year. With Android, on the other hand, there is never a lack of variety. Android phones come in all shapes and sizes, with dozens of manufacturers releasing dozens of new models every year. True, Android phones aren't as diverse as they used to be, as most of them now gravitate towards a similar design, but OEMs still find a way to cram something different and unique into every phone, potentially cutting some corners and making it more affordable. It goes without saying that this category is a clear win for Android. Much like the previous category, iOS is basically set up to fail from the get-go. Unless you root an iPhone, customization options are borderline non-existent. Sure, it is a fast and remarkably stable operating system, but when it comes to customizability, it's sorely lacking. The Android experience is, of course, the polar opposite. Stock Android in particular, or phones running on some of the more flexible launchers like the Nova launcher, offers an almost unparalleled degree of customizability when it comes to personalizing your experience. And we only say almost unparalleled because a rooted Android phone can take this even further. Albeit rooting does carry certain risks. It can render your warranty void, it can lead to stability issues, and in some cases, can lead to your phone getting bricked. Naturally, the winner here is Android, but whether you prefer a high degree of customizability compared to a streamlined app grid is entirely subjective. You knew this was coming, and here it is. Affordability. Apple devices are notorious for their exorbitant prices, and the iPhone is no exception. With Android, on the other hand, you can get a phone for under $100. However, the saying does hold true. If you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. And if you spend so little on a phone, you can expect abysmal performance. Still, mid-range Android phones can be found at a fraction of the price of an iPhone. And the only way to get a more affordable iPhone right now is to go with an older model or just get a used phone. Although even used iPhones can be quite pricey because of how long they're kept up to date. In any case, Android phones are available at much lower prices, and even some high-end flagships can cost quite a bit less than the latest iPhone. Now, while Android phones may be more affordable, they definitely don't retain their value nearly as well. In truth, an iPhone may very well be a more cost-efficient choice in the long run. This may seem like a ludicrous statement, but bear with us. As already mentioned, iPhones aren't fast because of their hardware. It's because of how well optimized their software is. Every iPhone receives constant OS updates for roughly 5 years after its launch. Ultimately, this makes them more future-proof and also increases their reselling price. Conversely, Android flagships generally only get 2 to 3 years of OS updates, and mid-range phones get 1 or 2. All the while, low-end phones are usually stuck with the version of Android that they ship with. Plus, updates can be terribly slow to roll out to devices, whereas iOS updates roll out globally at the same time. So if you're someone who has a habit of changing phones frequently and are unwilling to settle for anything less than a flagship, your old iPhone would fetch a higher secondhand price than an old Android flagship would. With that said, the win in this category goes to iOS. So let's recap. The iPhones running iOS offer superior performance, apps that are safer and more stable, long-term OTA updates, and better long-term value. Meanwhile, the Android phones are generally cheaper, allow for a much greater degree of freedom, have a customizable interface, a greater variety of apps, as well as a greater variety of devices to choose from. In the end, both operating systems and their hardware platforms have their advantages and disadvantages. So the ultimate answer as to which is better will end up being largely subjective and dependent on what you're looking for in a phone. And there you have it, iOS versus Android. We tried to be as objective as humanly possible, but feel free to let us know where you stand on this in the comments below. Just be civil about it. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can even press the bell icon to get notified when new videos come out. In the meantime, may your games be fun and your losses few, and as always, we'll see you next time on Gaming Scan.